Welcome to the Conservation Corps North Bay Training Module number 8, which deals with stress and trauma. And since we're looking at module number 8, then you should have in front of you your module worksheet number 8. And as I've said all along at the beginning of each module, these worksheets are really important. They allow you to dive deeper into the material, and they do ask you to give some written responses, and I realize that sometimes that can be a pain, but I think your written responses are very important. And I would encourage you at the completion of each module and completion of the worksheet that you share your opinions and insights with a colleague, with a supervisor, with another person, anyone who that you can share your insights and ideas with. Now, this particular module, last module looked at the Module 7 looked at the concept, a very, very powerful concept of group climate. And it talked about climate in terms of a supportive climate or a defensive climate. And both of these two categories of climates are characterized by very specific patterns of behavior. A supportive climate, there's a feeling of acceptance, belonging. A defensive climate, you feel threatened and so on. But we've gone over all of that. And the other important thing about the concept of climate is the reciprocal relationship between climate and behavior. If you can control the climate of a group, if you can adapt or manipulate or control the climate of a group, you can, in essence, then adapt or control or manipulate the behavior of the individuals within the group. And also, if you can enter into a, let's say, a defensive climate and start to adjust it by adjusting your behaviors, you can, by actually changing behaviors of the individuals within the group, you can change the group climate. So that was Module 7. Now, Module number 8, this module will look at the concepts of stress, both positive and negative, and trauma, and the potential psychological, emotional, and physical effects on a person's growth and development. For the purpose of this module, stress and trauma are viewed along a continuum, with positive stress at one extreme and totally debilitating trauma at the other extreme. In the example that you're looking at on the screen, this example deals with the effects of environmental stimulation or stress on a person's performance. Consider the graphic you're looking at. It depicts a relationship between environmental stimulation, positive and negative stress, on an individual's performance. Now, that performance in this instance would be work, but it could be performance in interpersonal relationships, performance at school, performance anywhere. Now, in the graphic, the horizontal line on the bottom depicts environmental stimulation or stress level. On the far left, that represents very low stress or environmental stimulation. In the middle is sort of a medium amount of stress, and at the far right extreme is a very high level of stress. The vertical line going up and down depicts the performance of an individual, let's say job performance in this case. The bottom of that indicates very low performance, and the top indicates optimum performance. As the diagram indicates, extremely low environmental levels of stimulation or stress leads to inaction, or in this case, they're referring to it as sleep. As environmental stimulation or stress levels begin to increase slightly, performance also starts to increase. Eventually, there comes a point where the environmental stimulation or stress level and performance level are at their optimum. There's a perfect balance between environmental stimulation and stress or performance. But as we see in the diagram, as the environmental stimulation or stress levels continue to increase, the stress begins to become too overwhelming and performance begins to deteriorate a little bit. The individual can still function, but performance is impaired. And finally, as stimulation and stress continue to increase, it reaches a point where the effects become toxic. The effects of stress become toxic, and the individual begins to psychologically, emotionally, and physically deteriorate. So the point is that there is a certain amount of environmental stimulation or stress that is necessary for optimum performance, but too much stress or trauma and the stimulation begin to have a negative effect on our lives and on our performance. What I'd like you to do when I prompt you now is I'd like you to put the video on pause, and I'd like you to go to page 2 in your worksheet and respond to the prompt asking you to describe your experiences with stress, both positive and negative. And then when you finish responding, put the video back on play. So for now, please put the video on pause. Okay, well, hopefully you responded to the prompt on stress. So next, we're going to examine a model of how negative stress begins and may eventually lead to toxic stress or to trauma. There is a construct called the success-failure ratio that may contribute to the beginnings of an individual's sliding towards negative stress and possibly full-blown trauma. It's sort of a pre-trauma condition. In mathematical terms, the success-failure ratio is the result of the number of an individual's perceived successes divided by the number of the individual's perceived failures over a given period of time. Maybe a day, maybe a week, maybe entire childhood, maybe an entire adolescence, but a period of time. And the success-failure ratio is not an actual mathematical or statistical formula or measure, but rather an informal scorecard that most of us keep consciously, but more likely unconsciously, to gauge our self-worth or self-esteem. It's sort of an ongoing self-evaluation that we do in sort of our subconscious mind. In order for a person to have a reasonably good opinion of themselves, to feel good about themselves, their success-failure ratio needs to be greater than 1. Their perceived successes must be greater than their perceived failures. And by the way, the word perceived is central to this construct because in reality, you or I or a person may be involved in behaviors that produce many successes and few failures, but we may not perceive them as such. We may perceive them as failures. And so even though they are successes, if we don't see them as successes, then we will see them as failures. Well, let's take a look at the examples here. Let's take a look at person 1. Person 1 had, let's say over a course of a day, person 1 had 10 perceived successes and 2 perceived failures. Well, so their success-failure ratio would be the number of successes, 10, divided by the number of failures, 2, which is equal to 5, which is greater, way greater than the number 1. So that person had a good day. Now, in contrast, person 2, let's say for their day, they had 3 perceived successes and 9 perceived failures. Well, their success-failure ratio would be successes, which was 3, over perceived failures, which was 9, which would be 0.33 or 1/3, which is less than 1. So they didn't have such a good day. Now, in his New York Times bestseller, Yuval Harari, he was an author, and the book that he wrote was called Sapiens, A Brief History of Mankind. He makes the point that the reason that Homo sapiens, which are you and I, came to dominate over all other sapien species that were around at the dawn of civilization, and there were a lot of different sapient species, Homo sapien being one of them, but the reason that Homo sapiens sort of took over the world was because of their ability to live cooperatively in social groups characterized by the formation of strong personal bonds. So human beings we're social animals, and we have an innate desire, a built-in desire to belong, to be recognized, and to be accepted. Being successful or feeling good about oneself is much more than sort of winning a race or coming in first in an event, winning a contest or something like that. Success is internalized when we as individuals receive feedback from our community and in our environment that meets our innate desire to belong, to be recognized, and to be accepted. So next we're going to look at some examples of various environmental areas, different areas in our environment, in our community, and how they can affect our success-failure ratio. Okay, well, this graphic depicts how environmental feedback, which would be down this column here, so feedback from family, peers, employees, from the community, from school, from our life skills, how environmental feedback can lead to perceived successes or failures, eventually resulting in a positive success-failure ratio or a negative success-failure ratio. So you can see here, in terms of family, perceived successes, most positive responses from family interactions, that would be, so you're getting mostly positive stuff from your family, that's success. You get frequent negative stuff, that's failure. In terms of peers, the same kind of a thing. So what I'd like you to do when I prompt you is I'd like you to put the video on pause and go to page 4 in your worksheet. And when you're there, take a look at the graphic and then respond in writing to the prompt below the graphic, which asks you to evaluate yourselves in the different areas of feedback that you get from your community and your environment in terms of perceived successes and failures. So go to page 4 in your worksheet and respond to the prompt asking you to evaluate your own success-failure ratio over the past 6 months. When you have completed that, please turn the video back on. So please put the video on pause now. Okay, so now that you have evaluated yourself in terms of your success-failure ratio over the past 6 months in the different areas in terms of family and peers and so on, employees and community, let's go on. We're going to now take a look at what is called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey and its relationship to stress and trauma. We're going to watch a 16-minute video talk by Dr. Nadine Harris about the Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey and the devastating effects that adverse experiences in childhood can have on an individual's physical, emotional, and psychological development. As you listen to the video, I would encourage you to keep in mind that you may be working with clients who have experienced adverse conditions while growing up, and the effects these experiences may have on their personality and on their behavior. At the end of the video, you will be prompted to go to page 6 in your worksheet and respond to the prompt relating to the video. What relevance is this video to you? What relevance is to the clients that you work with? Okay, let's watch the video, and then at the end of the video, we'll shut this video. We're going to watch Dr. Harris for 16 minutes.
In the mid-90s, the CDC and Kaiser Permanente discovered an exposure that dramatically increased the risk for 7 out of 10 of the leading causes of death in the United States. In high doses, it affects brain development, the immune system, hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. Folks who are exposed in very high doses have triple the lifetime risk of heart disease and lung cancer, and a 20-year difference in life expectancy. And yet doctors today are not trained in routine screening or treatment. Now, the exposure I'm talking about is not a pesticide or packaging chemical. It's childhood trauma. Okay. What kind of trauma am I talking about here? I'm not talking about failing a test or losing a basketball game. I am talking about threats that are so severe or pervasive that they literally get under our skin and change our physiology. Things like abuse or neglect, or growing up with a parent who struggles with mental illness or substance dependence. Now, for a long time, I viewed these things in the way I was trained to view them. Either as a social problem, refer to social services, or as a mental health problem, refer to mental health services. And then something happened to make me rethink my entire approach. When I finished my residency, I wanted to go someplace where I felt really needed, someplace where I could make a difference. So I came to work for California Pacific Medical Center, one of the best private hospitals in Northern California. And together, we opened a clinic in Bayview, Hunters Point, one of the poorest, most underserved neighborhoods in San Francisco. Now, prior to that point, there had been only one pediatrician in all of Bayview to serve more than 10,000 children. So we hung a shingle and we were able to provide top quality care regardless of ability to pay. It was so cool. We targeted the typical health disparities: access to care, immunization rates, asthma hospitalization rates, and we hit all of our numbers. We felt very proud of ourselves. But then I started noticing a disturbing trend. A lot of kids were being referred to me for ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But when I actually did a thorough history and physical, what I found was that for most of my patients, I couldn't make a diagnosis of ADHD. Most of the kids I was seeing had experienced such severe trauma that it felt like something else was going on. Somehow, I was missing something important. Now, before I did my residency, I did a master's degree in public health. And one of the things that they teach you in public health school is that if you're a doctor and you see 100 kids that all drink from the same well, and 98 of them develop diarrhea, you can go ahead and write that prescription for dose after dose after dose of antibiotics, or you can walk over and say, what the hell is in this well? So I began reading everything that I could get my hands on about how exposure to adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children. And then one day, my colleague walked into my office and he said, Dr. Burke, have you seen this? In his hand was a copy of a research study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. That day changed my clinical practice and ultimately my career. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study is something that everybody needs to know about. It was done by Dr. Vince Felitti at Kaiser and Dr. Bob Onda at the CDC, and together they asked 17,500 adults about their history of exposure to what they called adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. Those include physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, physical or emotional neglect, parental mental illness, substance dependence, incarceration, parental separation or divorce, or domestic violence. For every yes, you would get a point on your ACE score. And then what they did was they correlated these ACE scores against health outcomes. What they found was striking. Two things. Number one, ACEs are incredibly common. 67% of the population had at least one ACE, and 12.6%, 1 in 8, had 4 or more ACEs. The second thing that they found was that there was a dose-response relationship between ACEs and health outcomes. The higher your ACE score, the worse your health outcomes. For a person with an ACE score of 4 or more, their relative risk of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease was 2.5 times that of someone with an ACE score of 0. For hepatitis, it was also 2.5 times. For depression, it was 4.5 times. For suicidality, it was 12 times. A person with an ACE score of 7 or more had triple the lifetime risk of lung cancer and 3.5 times the risk of ischemic heart disease, the #1 killer in the United States of America. Well, of course, this makes sense. You know, some people looked at this data and they said, come on, you have a rough childhood, you're more likely to drink and smoke and do all these things that are going to ruin your health. This isn't science. This is just bad behavior. It turns out this is exactly where the science comes in. We now understand better than we ever have before how exposure to early adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children. It affects areas like the nucleus accumbens, the pleasure and reward center of the brain that is implicated in substance dependence. It inhibits the prefrontal cortex, which is necessary for impulse control and executive function, a critical area for learning. And on MRI scans, we see measurable differences in the amygdala, the brain's fear response center. So there are real neurologic reasons why folks exposed to high doses of adversity are more likely to engage in high-risk behavior. And that's important to know. But it turns out that even if you don't engage in any high-risk behavior, you're still more likely to develop heart disease or cancer. The reason for this has to do with the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the brain's and body's stress response system that governs our fight or flight response. How does it work? Well, imagine you're walking in the forest and you see a bear. Immediately, your hypothalamus sends a signal to your pituitary, which sends a signal to your adrenal gland that says, release stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol. And so your heart starts to pound, your pupils dilate, your airways open up, and you are ready to either fight that bear or run from the bear. And that is wonderful if you're in a forest and there's a bear. But the problem is what happens when the bear comes home every night. And this system is activated over and over and over again. And it goes from being adaptive or life-saving to maladaptive or health damaging. Children are especially sensitive to this repeated stress activation because their brains and bodies are just developing. High doses of adversity not only affect brain structure and function, they affect the developing immune system, developing hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. So for me, this information threw my old training out the window, because when we understand the mechanism of a disease, when we know not only which pathways are disrupted, but how, then as doctors, it is our job to use this science for prevention and treatment. That's what we do. So in San Francisco, we created the Center for Youth Wellness to prevent, screen, and heal the impacts of ACEs and toxic stress. We started simply with routine screening of every one of our kids at their regular physical, because I know that if my patient has an ACE score of 4, she's 2.5 times as likely to develop hepatitis or COPD. She's 4.5 times as likely to become depressed, and she's 12 times as likely to attempt to take her own life as my patient with 0 ACEs. I know that when she's in my exam room. For our patients who do screen positive, we have a multidisciplinary treatment team that works to reduce the dose of adversity and treat symptoms using best practices, including home visits, care coordination, mental health care, nutrition, holistic interventions, and yes, medication when necessary. But we also educate parents about the impact of ACEs and toxic stress the same way you would for covering electrical outlets or lead poisoning. And we tailor the care of our asthmatics and our diabetics in a way that recognizes that they may need more aggressive treatment given the changes to their hormonal and immune systems. So the other thing that happens when you understand this science is that you'll want to shout it from the rooftops, because this isn't just an issue for kids in Bayview. I figured the minute that everybody else heard about this, it would be routine screening, multidisciplinary treatment teams, and it would be a race to the most effective clinical treatment protocols. Yeah, that did not happen. And that was a huge learning for me. What I had thought of as simply best clinical practice, I now understand to be a movement. In the words of Dr. Robert Block, the former president of the American Academy of Pediatrics, adverse childhood experiences are the single greatest unaddressed public health threat facing our nation today. And for a lot of people, that's a terrifying prospect. The scope and scale of the problem seems so large that it feels overwhelming to think about how we might approach it. But for me, that's actually where the hope lies. Because when we have the right framework, when we recognize this to be a public health crisis, then we can begin to use the right toolkit to come up with solutions. From tobacco to lead poisoning to HIV/AIDS, the United States actually has quite a strong track record with addressing public health problems. But replicating those successes with ACEs and toxic stress is going to take determination and commitment. And when I look at what our nation's response has been so far, I wonder, why haven't we taken this more seriously? At first, I thought that we marginalized the issue because it doesn't apply to us, right? That's an issue for those kids in those neighborhoods, which is weird because the data doesn't bear that out. The original ACEs study was done in a population that was 70% Caucasian, 70% college educated. But then, the more I talk to folks, I'm beginning to think that maybe I had it completely backwards. If I were to ask how many people in this room grew up with a family member who suffered from mental illness, I bet a few hands would go up. And then if I were to ask how many folks had a parent who maybe drank too much, or who really believed that if you spare the rod, you spoil the child, I bet a few more hands would go up. Even in this room, this is an issue that touches many of us. And I'm beginning to believe that we marginalize the issue because it does apply to us. Maybe it's easier to see in other zip codes because we don't want to look at it. We'd rather be sick. Fortunately, scientific advances and, frankly, economic realities make that option less viable every day. The science is clear. Early adversity dramatically affects health across a lifetime. Today, we are beginning to understand how to interrupt the progression from early adversity to disease and early death. And 30 years from now, the child who has a high ACE score and whose behavioral symptoms go unrecognized, whose asthma management is not connected, and who goes on to develop high blood pressure and early heart disease or cancer will be just as anomalous as a 6-month mortality from HIV/AIDS. People will look at that situation and say, what the heck happened there? This is treatable. This is beatable. The single most important thing that we need today is the courage to look this problem in the face and say, this is real, and this is all of us.
Well, a very strong presentation by Dr. Harris. She makes the excellent point that exposure to extreme adversity in high doses at a young age, when a child is exposed to extreme adversity, has devastating effects on the physiology, the psychology, and the emotional state of individuals, especially young individuals. And in fact, it affects their hormonal development and their immune system development and leaves them open to all different kinds of crazy medical situations. And again, I want to reiterate to keep in mind, I want to encourage you to keep in mind that you may be working with clients who have experienced adverse conditions while growing up and how these may affect their behaviors. Now, what I'd like you to do right now, I'm going to prompt you, is I'd like you to put the video on pause and I'd like you to go to page 6 of your worksheet and respond to the prompt about the video. And when you're finished responding and writing, then turn the video back on again. So please turn the video off now. Okay, well, let's continue on. Now, here are some statistics about the ACEs and what impact do ACEs have. And Dr. Harris talked about a dose-response relationship. And what that means is this. As the number of ACEs increases, so does the risk of negative health outcomes. So if your ACE score is 0, you're pretty okay. And as your ACE score increases, you're at risk for health outcomes, for negative health outcomes. And an ACE score is a tally of different types of abuse, neglect, and other hallmarks of a rough childhood. And according to the Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey, the rougher your childhood, the higher your score is likely to be, and the higher your risk for later health problems. And by the way, later on at the end of this module and at the end of your worksheet, the ACE survey, which is just 10 questions, is there, so you could take it if you would like. Let's take a look at some other data. Okay, now possible risk outcomes. In terms of behavior, outcomes: lack of activity, smoking, alcoholism, drug use, missed work. Possible physical and mental health problems: severe obesity, diabetes, depression, increased suicide, sexually transmitted diseases, heart disease, cancer, stroke, COPD or emphysema, broken bones. So a whole bunch of negative behavioral, physical, and mental effects are involved in individuals who have higher elevated ACE scores. Here is the ACE study revealed the following estimates. In terms of abuse, the percentage of study participants that experienced a specific ACE score. In terms of physical abuse, now realize there were 17,000 people who were surveyed, 70% Caucasian, 70% college educated. Of the 17,000, 28.3%, or approximately 4,760, reported physical abuse. 20.7%, or approximately 3,400, reported sexual abuse. 10.6%, or approximately 1,700, reported emotional abuse. In terms of neglect, of the 17,000, 14.8%, or approximately 2,550, reported emotional neglect. 9.9%, or approximately 1,700 individuals, reported physical neglect. Those are pretty powerful. Household dysfunction. At the top of this graphic, it depicts the reported household dysfunction of the 17,000 survey participants. 26.9%, or approximately 4,590 respondents, reported living in a household where there was substance abuse. 23.3%, or approximately 3,910 people reported living in a household where there was parental divorce. 19.4%, or approximately 3,230 respondents, reported living in a household where there was some form of mental illness. 12.7%, or approximately 2,210 respondents, reported living in a household where the mother was treated violently. And 4.7%, or approximately 850 respondents, reported living in a household where one member was jailed. The bottom part of the graphic represents the number and percentage of participants who experienced 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4 adverse childhood experiences. 36%, or approximately 6,120 respondents, reported experiencing no adverse childhood experiences. 26%, or approximately 4,420, reported having one adverse childhood experience. 16%, or approximately 2,720, two adverse childhood experiences. 9.5%, or 1,615, experienced 3 ACE, had a score of 3. 12.4%, or 2,040, reported having experienced 4 ACEs. And finally, 64% of all respondents, so 10,880, approximately 10,880, experienced at least one ACE, one positive ACE score. Unlike negative stress or negative success-failure ratios, individual trauma results from an event or series of events or set of circumstances that is experienced as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on an individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. And this is exactly what the ACE scores are looking at. The ACE scores are looking at this series of totally adverse effects on an individual. It's correlated with worsening physical, psychological, and social economic outcomes, and it can result in a feeling of helplessness that may be toxic or extremely debilitating. The chart here shows the escalating toxic effect of adverse childhood experiences. So adverse childhood experiences, you can see at the bottom, the base, and an individual who experiences ACEs may be vulnerable to disrupted neurological development, social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, adoption of health risk behaviors, increased disease, disability, and social problems, and even early death. So this ACE score is like really, really important and has devastating effects. The following graphic here depicts the prevalence of trauma in high-risk populations. If we start at the top, 70% of children in foster care experience some form of trauma as a result of that foster care. 75% of adults in substance abuse programs experience some form of trauma as a result of those programs. 90% of children involved in the juvenile justice system experience some form of trauma. 93% of homeless mothers with a history of interpersonal trauma report experiencing some form of trauma. 96%, almost 100%, 96% of adolescent inpatients report exposure to some form of trauma while as an inpatient. 98% of female offenders who have experienced domestic violence report exposure to some form of trauma. So trauma has just devastating effects, and it is all around us. And in fact, in the next training video, we're going to deal with trauma and its effects in full detail. Here, it's just to raise your consciousness. On this screen is the first 5 questions in the Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey. And the next screen will be questions 6 to 10. In case you would like to take the survey, the questions 1 through 10 appear on pages 8 and 9 of your worksheet. And here is the questions 6 to 10. It's a very, very simple survey. If you take the survey, remember that the ACE score isn't a crystal ball. It's just meant as a guidance, as a barometer. It tells you about one type of risk factor among many. It doesn't directly take into account your diet or your genes or whether you smoke or whether you drink excessively, to name just a few of the other major influences on health. So it's not a death sentence if you have an ACE score of 2 or 3 or 4, but it may be indicative. To learn more, I would suggest that you check the Center for Disease Control ACE study website. You'll find, among other things, a list of studies that explores the way adverse childhood experiences have been linked to a variety of adult conditions ranging from increased headaches to depression to heart disease. The website, the URL is cdc.gov, and it's an excellent resource. Well, okay, well that's it for this video. Thank you very much. And in the next video, we will now talk about the effects that trauma has on the individual's development and behavior. Thank you.